Mr. Thompson here. We're looking at U.S. History Standard 9, evaluate key events, ideas, and individuals related to the Civil War. In particular, we're looking at Part A of that standard, explain the importance of the growing economic disparity between the North and South through an examination of population, industrial output, and functioning railroads. The North and South were very different regions in terms of physical and economic resources at the time of the Civil War. Fighting the war challenged both sides to supply, to equip, to maintain an army for the duration of this lengthy and very costly war. The North had advantages that allowed them to conduct war better. The North had a greater population to draw soldiers from. The North had much better transportation systems, so they were able to move resources around easier. And their industrial output, so their factory production, was far superior, so they were better able to equip soldiers to fight. In contrast, the South in each of these categories was at a far disadvantage. So just looking at the data, you would think that the North would have a swift, very decisive victory over the South. The North ultimately won, so the Union won. We're still the United States, but it was hard fought and it was lengthy. The South made up for its disadvantages through strong military leadership that relied on efficiency and strategy that prolonged the war. The differences between the North and South had been decades in the making. Once the Industrial Revolution began, the North and South developed differently. The North evolved into a more industrial economy with larger factories and a larger immigrant population that worked in the factories for cheap wages. By the mid 19th century, so the 1850s, the North's wealth had substantially grown because of industrial production. However, the South remained largely agricultural. Cotton was king, and the demand for southern grown cotton was in high demand from northern textile factories and other world markets. However, most of the farmers in the South were actually just small based farmers. Only a very small percentage of them were the large plantation based farms that produced the greatest amount of wealth. Northern wealth from industrial production resulted in cash assets, while Southern wealth was typically tied up in land and slave investments. Therefore, when the Civil War began, the North was actually able to fund the military operation much easier because of the available cash, the sale of government bonds, and taxation. The South struggled to finance the war and tried desperately, though unsuccessfully, to acquire a foreign alliance to help supplement the Confederate operation. The Union blockade of the southern coastline limited the South's ability to trade cotton, to export cotton, which further hurt Confederate finances. The South printed large quantities of paper money, which had dangerous inflationary consequences. Inflation, a basic economic principle where the value of your money decreases because the quantity of it available increases. The factors of population, infrastructure, and industrial production reflect this wide gap between the North and the South at the time of the Civil War. In each area, the North had the advantage. Again, the Northern economy was based on industry and trade, while the Southern economy was based on agriculture. The North had a greater advantage on industrial production, so they were able to manufacture and supply weapons to soldiers much easier than the South. In the South, soldiers typically used their own weapons. The food production in the North was twice as much as that in the South. The South used much of its cultivation land for cotton. The North had 71% of the US population, as opposed to the South's 29% of the US population. So, much bigger pool in the North of people to pull from for soldiers. Also, of that smaller population in the South, about 33% of that population were slaves, while the North had very few slaves. The majority of that population were free. In the North, they had a much larger railroad network. About 71% of the railroad network was in the North, as opposed to the South's 29% of the railroad network. With the better railroad network, the North was more easily able to transport supplies and soldiers as opposed to the South. Again, the North held the advantage in each of these categories and was much better off at conducting war than the South.